thank you so much all for joining us. Welcome to this evening's session. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce you all, if you've not met him before, to World War II military historian Richard Bass. He's going to be teaching us a little bit today about some of our favourite dune systems, or one of my favourites certainly, Braunton Burrows on the North Devon coast. And I think we're all going to learn a lot about the American forces when they used this as a training ground in World War II, something that I certainly know absolutely nothing about, and I'm really excited to learn more. So without further ado, Richard, I'll hand over to you.
Yes, hello everybody. The Assault Training Centre in North Devon encompasses a huge amount of sand dunes and coastline. It really goes back to about 1940, when we, Britain as a nation, were actually being thrown out of Europe by the German army. They chased us all the way across France and Belgium, and we ended up at Dunkirk. And we were jolly lucky to actually get everybody out, or most of the people out. The problem with that was, of course, as soon as that had finished, the Germans threatened to actually invade us. We were facing an invasion. The last one we had was 1066, but now, of course, the Germans were threatening to do this. We had an army that had been shredded at Dunkirk. We had really nothing very much at all to defend ourselves. All we could do was actually to defend our beaches. And we used miles upon mile of barbed wire. And the only other thing we could do, of course, was plant mines. Saunton, of course, Saunton Beach itself, the foreshore there was littered with mines planted by the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, who were actually charged with looking after and defending that particular part of the coastline. It looks as if the Germans thought that North Devon was actually pretty good for invasion beaches, as you can see. It's Instow, Westward Ho, Saunton, Croydon, Woolacombe, and they even thought that Ilfracombe was a good port they could probably land at. So North Devon really figured quite strongly in the German invasion plans. Of course, the British cynical humour came through. In the event of invasion, we would close for half an hour. Well, that was somebody who obviously didn't really believe that that's actually going to happen. But these were the guys that actually stood between us and the Germans at the time, the Home Guard. They did a sterling job, I must admit. The Japanese did us a favour, of course, by attacking Pearl Harbor in 1941, which catapulted the American nation into World War II. Luckily, in 1943, it was agreed between President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill that the war in Europe would be dealt with first, and then everybody's attention would then turn to the Pacific. So Europe was the focus of attention. And almost immediately, America began to send tens of thousands of American troops into Britain, first to Northern Ireland and then into Britain. And this was a never-ending flow of troops coming into the country. And they were everywhere. They were all over the place, particularly in the counties of Cornwall and Devon, which became rather like a military barracks. Every single village had some Americans with them somewhere. The man charged with the invasion of Europe, because this is the only way that it was going to happen, was General Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower. He was in charge overall of the invasion plans itself. In charge of the land element was General Bernard Montgomery. He was the hero of El Alamein in North Africa, where he had amassed overwhelming numbers of artillery, tanks, infantry, and aircraft, and absolutely hammered Rommel's Africa Corps. And he did that simply by having overwhelming numbers. He outnumbered him and outgunned him in every possible way. So Montgomery had a reputation to preserve. The invasion beaches themselves had already been selected in the Bay of the Seine, in Lower Normandy. And the original plan actually was for 3 beaches to be assaulted. There we are, Sword, Juno, and Gold. Originally, they were known as Goldfish, Jellyfish, and Swordfish, but Churchill personally intervened and said he's not having that at all. So they were changed, the names were changed. But then Montgomery got involved, and of course he needed to win. to maintain his reputation. And he decided now he'd got the Americans on his side, he was going to use them over in the western part on Omaha and Utah beaches. These were two beaches. These were difficult. They were completely different to the British and Canadian beaches. On Omaha Beach itself, there was a huge 200 yards of flat sand, and immediately there were sandy bluffs that tanks could not climb. Utah Beach was quite the opposite. It was flooded right behind the beach itself, but there were only 4 little roadways off the beach to get inland. So tanks couldn't be used there either. And then, of course, Montgomery he wanted an airborne drop at roundabout St. Mary Glees, and also at Pegasus Bridge to cover the flanks. And that was the way that Montgomery actually changed the D-Day plans. They worked, but he did change them. Early 1943, the American High Command were so pleased with themselves that they had actually imported tens of thousands of American troops ready for the invasion of Europe, until somebody pointed out to them the fact that they had no training whatsoever in how to assault a heavily defended enemy coastline. There were no tactics for it at all. So they really drastically and rapidly needed somewhere to train these troops of theirs. And then, of course, they needed somebody to head it up. And they went through the personnel files and they came across a guy called Paul Thompson, Lieutenant Colonel, US Army engineer. He was driving a desk in Washington and kicking his heels, really, desperate to get into the fight in Europe. He was approached for the simple reason that he had been a military attaché in Berlin. So he worked with the German army. He knew their tactics. He knew how they actually ran things, what they would do, how they would do it, their strengths and their weaknesses. So he was very important, and he got the job. And he very quickly came over to England, and then he started to look around. Okay, how does he actually do his job? Well, he looked in the basic field manual where he found heavily defended enemy coastline, and it said these are to be avoided at all costs and should be taken from the rear. So it then became quite evident to him that he actually had to make up his own doctrine for taking on this particular job. And it was at that point, I think he probably realized that the success or failure of American invasion of Europe actually was on his shoulders. But what he did, he called together experts from all arms, from all experts from the British Army, from the Royal Air Force, from the US. He called them all together and they began to thrash out in a month. They began to thrash out a doctrine for taking on the German-held coastline of Normandy. And they came up with a training package as well. This is Paul Thompson's actual map. You can see little pencil marks on there where he decided things ought to be put together. And the assault training center that he was given actually ran all the way from Mort Point. That one? Thank you. Yes, ran all the way in the north from Mort Point, all the way Woolacombe Bay, Baggy Point, Croyd, at Saunton, and eventually Crow Point and Instow, right at the very south. He had actually approached the British government and said, that he really needed some sort of training area for his troops. And the British government said, well, it's, we're jolly hard luck, but we've got them all. The British and Canadians, we're using all the training beaches. There's absolutely nothing. Oh, there is one, but that's far too rough and stormy for training. So you'd better have that. And luckily, it turned out that Woolacombe beaches are in fact almost identical in almost every respect to Omaha Beach. But immediately, once he'd taken over the area, his task given to him by the American High Command was to subdue the enemy defenses on the beach, but also to establish a beachhead, which means fighting inland for over 1,000 yards. And to do that, of course, Thompson approached the British government again and said, to do this, I need you to evacuate the villages of Saunton, Georgeham, Croyd, Woolacombe. And the British government said, there's no way you're going to do that at all. So Paul Thompson's mission was cut right back in half, and all he could do was teach the troops new tactics that had been thrashed out for how to assault the enemy defences on the beach. The problem was, of course, as soon as he got to Staunton, which was going to be used as practice assault beaches, there were the mines that had been left behind by the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. And he immediately sent in the combat engineers to get rid of the mines. And sadly, they lost 3 men, were killed by the mines, at which point Paul Thompson said, okay, that's it. What we're going to do, he just put wire around it and it's out of bounds to everybody. And that's the way it actually stayed, right the way through training. The area itself was actually divided up. The roads themselves, the Americans weren't very good at driving on Devon roads, as a result of which they actually had to tell them whether they were 2 lanes or single lanes, where the junctions were numbered, and the grading of the roads themselves. That still didn't stop a lot of Americans driving on the wrong side of the road and causing a lot of accidents with local people. The areas themselves, all the way from the north of Mort Point all the way down to Instow. The whole area itself was actually, the roads were all classified, as I said earlier on. The beaches themselves were classified and everything was graded. The beaches themselves, they were given code names and numbers. The training ranges, they were numbered all the way all the way through to number 52. Areas were coded A all the way up to M, all the way from south to north, and every road junction and crossroads was actually numbered. It made for easy navigation and made an awful lot of sense. The golf course, Staunton Golf Course, had been established in 1897 and had gradually been growing in status all ever since. But the problem was, of course, it was all included in the Braunton Burrows area of the Assault Training Centre. And a lot of the club itself actually had to close down. The course itself had this whopping great big obstacle course built all over it. And also a little bit further down, they had the flamethrower range. That was on the greens and the fairways, a little to the south of the golf course itself. When the golf course took over they got their course back at the end of the war, they did say, what on earth had the Americans done with the 14th green? They never found the answer to that. But almost immediately, everything started to be built. Everything was concrete. The engineers actually moved in. They used concrete. They had plenty of sand around. They used a local quarry for the stone, and they began to construct everything that was required. Yeah, you can see there, the picture at the top right, those are something called dragon's teeth. They're an anti-tank obstacle because the tanks simply cannot drive over those. And at the bottom, you can see where they're actually constructing concrete landing craft. And we'll come to the reason for that later on. Initially, the engineers built 4-sided pillboxes with a roof on the top. The problem with that was that when the training troops actually fired at it, of course, the whole thing was demolished. And the engineers couldn't repair them or rebuild them quickly enough for the next training crew. As a result of which they came up with a rather interesting plan. All they would do, they would build a sort of a pseudo pillbox. They just have the front with the sculpted embrasure at the front, 2 wings either side. And as they got damaged and destroyed, so they would actually just put on another bit of concrete at the front. And this one you can see has been repaired 3 times. And that is really one of the most popular, one of the most frequently found remains. You can see there, aerial 1946, with the little blue arrow that is one of those concrete faces. They're all aligned the same way. So when somebody's shooting at it from the bottom right, anything that went over the top of it would simply sail off across Staunton, straight out into the bay and out to sea. That's safety, health and safety. Now, to have amphibious training, you need landing craft. So the US Navy moved into Instow. They moved in and they had 85 craft, 850 men. They couldn't billet everybody in the little villages of Instow and roundabout. So Well, they did. They actually they got a ferry boat, the USS President Warfield, and that actually made its way across the Atlantic in a convoy. It arrived and was actually anchored off Appledore. And from there, the US Navy personnel used it as a barrack ship. That's where they lived, that's where they ate their meals, and that's where they slept. And curiously, at the end of the war, it was purchased by a Jewish organization, and they tried to take the displaced persons back to Israel. And you may remember the film Exodus, where there was no port in the Mediterranean that would actually accept the ship. And they went round and round for an awful long time. But it's an interesting history of a ship. In Stowe Beach itself, that's where the landing craft were. They were repaired there. They were allowed to dry out on the beach as well. The landing craft, LCVP, stands for Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, also known as a Higgins boat, flat-bottomed and with a ramp at the front that simply dropped down. Capacity was 30 men, or 1G. Now, they did form the basis of Paul Thompson's doctrine for assaulting the enemy-held coastline. Because they held 30 men, that really is a starting point for the doctrine as to actually what followed. This is a 30-man assault team that conveniently fitted into these LCVPs, and there were dozens of them around. There were lots of them because shipping and transporting men equipment across the channel to Normandy was a problem. Big ships simply weren't available. So the small ones, the little landing craft, had to be used, which suited Thompson down to the ground. Within the 30-man assault team, there were little subsections. There were rifles. Well, obviously, if someone's shooting at you, you need somebody to shoot back, and it was for protection for all the other sub-teams within the assault team itself. Mortars, yeah, you had a couple of mortars there. They would simply fire, as you know, up into the air, and then they would drop down. That was to try and get into the drop a missile into the trenches, rather like the Ukrainians are doing at the moment. Bangalore torpedoes carried in threes, length of scaffold tube, filled with explosive. You screwed one end onto the next, to the next, to the next, shoved it under the barbed wire, pulled the igniter, and retired rather quickly. And that, of course, blew the barbed wire miles apart, which allowed everybody else to get through the gap. Bazookas, they're interesting because that's an anti-tank weapon. It was designed to take on and cripple a tank. But it was decided by the Assault Training Center staff that if you could get one of those bazooka rockets into the embrasure of a pillbox, then that's game over. You've neutralized it and you've done exactly what you're supposed to. So bazookas were used. Flamethrowers, well, if you've got flames coming at you, you're going to shut all doors and windows. And again, that would achieve the same effect, because then the last guys in, you didn't want to be in this lot, with the demolition team. And they had explosives. They would simply rush forward when the doors and windows are being closed, and they would wedge them up against the doors and pull the igniter, and again, retire very rapidly. And then thoughtfully, hopefully, between them, the whole bunker, pillbox or emplacement was completely destroyed, and they could move on. Training for all this took 3 weeks. The number of troops that went through, there was about 14,000 troops altogether. They didn't come all at the same time. They were spaced over September 43 right through to about April 1944. As you can see, I mean, these guys had never, apart from coming across the Atlantic in a bigger liner, they'd never been in a landing craft before. They knew how to fire a rifle, but here they were learning new tactics altogether. And they worked hard. They worked hard for 3 weeks. But every evening was virtually free. And certainly Sunday was free, although you were expected to go to church. And Saturday was completely open on the last day, which allowed, of course, the young American soldiers to head off into town to the villages to find the pubs and the girls, of course. But Monday morning, of course, it was back to the usual, back to work and get on with what you're supposed to be learning to do. Live ammunition and explosives were used exclusively. That's just what they did. They had to get the trainees used to the sights, sounds, and smells of battle. It was vital. It was inevitable, of course, that there were going to be casualties, and there were. These are just two examples. But the US Army, the High Command, believed that casualties were worth it because it indoctrinated everybody else into exactly what they needed. Again, it was not all hard work. There is a lovely pub called the Red Barn at Woolacombe, which is the headquarters of the Assault Training Centre. And this was run by the American Red Cross, who kept a book, who had to be signed in. Everybody had to be signed in with their name, where they come from. And that book is actually in Wartime Museum now. Fabulous source of information. But everything that was being built, this was British frogmen were sneaking onto the beaches of Normandy almost all the time. And when they snuck in, they would make little sketches of what they found. They would take sand measurements, and they would report back to the Assault Training Centre of exactly what they'd found. And these were all replicated on Braunton Burrows. So the troops themselves could actually work out how much explosive was needed to destroy it, where it had to be placed. If you look bottom left, there was a scaffold there with a big net down the side. That was on the golf course as well. That was really to get troops used to climbing down from a big ship into one of the landing craft. There were a lot of demonstrations. There were an awful lot of visitors to the Assault Training Centre. And here at Broadsands, you can see some of the demonstration obstacles. The closest to us, well, it's just a lump of concrete, but then you can see a sort of a pyramid shape. That again is a single dragon's tooth. Just beyond it is a concrete block. All of these were seen by the British frogmen on the beaches of Normandy. And just a little further along is a solid wall. And if you look at them today, you can still see where the explosions were when they were actually demonstrated. There we are. There's a guy who's actually worked out exactly how much explosive is needed and where it needed to be placed to destroy one of the dragon's teeth. Landing craft. As I said earlier, the amount of shipping to get everybody across the channel was very limited, as a result of which the LCT, which would take probably about 6 tanks, loads of trucks or loads of artillery, and Paul Thompson had 6 of them constructed, just the base and the jaws with a ramp. And because these LCTs were actually going to make more than one trip across the channel, so they had to get everybody on and off very, very quickly. Certainly off under fire, you'd get off pretty quick anyway. There we go. There's a picture of some of the artillery trying to get on or get round. And along the side, you could see corrugated sheeting there. That really just represented the side of the LCT. They were all to scale. And on the third landing craft itself, right at the very back, the British said, we're going to give you LCT Mark 5s. And as time went on, they said, no, we changed our mind. You're going to have the Mark 6s. And the only difference was there was about an extra 6 feet of deck. So the US engineers at the Assault Training Centre put an extra 6 feet of concrete at the back. And on the third landing craft, they actually put a finger in the wet concrete and put down there Company C, 1st Platoon, 146 engineers. So they left their mark. To give you an idea of how the sand has shifted and moved, the picture on the left, a couple of the top brass watching some sort of exercise on the beach, and you can see how close it is to the beach in the background. But today, that same observation post is something like 80 to 100 yards inland. You would expect that that coast to have actually been eroded, but it's not. In fact, there's a lot of deposition there, and it happens all the way along. That's the rocket wall. This is where the bazookas were tried out. Now that is what the majority of the concrete faces, the dummy pillboxes look like today, simply covered with blown sand. They form a natural barrier. It's the same as when you were a kid, you stood on the beach. When you stood in the water, the sand would simply be dragged away by the water. But here, the sand is just blown and forms great pyramids on top of the American wartime constructions. That's Matilda tank. She's a bit of a landmark on Braunton Burrows. There was the Combined Operations Experimental Establishment across the estuary at Westward Ho. And they tried all sorts of weird and wonderful things to assist with assaulting the beach, most of which, of course, were all based upon tanks. And when most of their experiments failed, they would then say to the Americans, "Do you want a tank?" And the Americans would fetch the tanks over and then use them for target practice. But I think this one's been destroyed, as you can see from bits in the background. This has been destroyed by the British Army after the end of the war. There were 14,000 troops, American troops, that were trained at the Assault Training Center that ran from September 1943 through to about April 1944. Of those 14,000, approximately 4,000 of them became casualties on D-Day. There were very few of the survivors of D-Day that made it to the war's end. And today, sadly, they've all passed on. But what about those mines that the Americans left behind? Well, in 1947, the British had a brilliant idea, very innovative. They actually had a high-pressure water pipeline all the way from the River Cane in Braunton Village, 2 or 3 miles away. And that went all the way onto the Braunton Burrows and all along the back of the minefields. And you can see the picture in the center there. They connected up this high pressure water pipeline to portable water hoses. And then they would simply wash out all the mines. So the foreshore and the dunes that right behind the foreshore at Saunton are nothing like how they were in 1943 or before, because they've all been washed away. Now that, yes, can I go back one? Yes, that one, the Assault Training Centre. That's the motif for a little group of us called Friends of the Assault Training Centre. Our idea is to maintain and explore all the American constructions, look after them and educate people, taking them on walks and so on. And our latest escapade was, thanks to a generous donation by the AONB, was to landscape 2 of the faces. As you can see there, there's the concrete, there's the hole at the bottom, and the whole thing was excavated. Well, 2 of them were actually excavated. There we are, that's the finished one. And we put an information board up as well. So we've got a couple of those, they're up there amongst the sand. Woolacombe, the Friends of the Assault Training Centre, we put on various events. Certainly 2013, that was the 70th anniversary. We held a mock assault on the beach at Woolacombe and laid some wreaths at the Woolacombe Memorial up on the greensward of Woolacombe itself. We then had another event, Devon D-Day we called it, in 2015. We used the landing craft again, as you can see. The following year, 2016, we had aircraft land on the beach. That was, again, quite something. Hundreds and hundreds of World War II vehicles were there. 2017, we did exactly the same and got the public involved this time, telling them stories. They did gymnastics. 2018, well, that's when we had tanks come along. The things just got bigger and bigger as time went on. But there we are, that's us. That's to preserve and promote the US Assault Training Center, historical matters through education, which is our aim.